So my name is Jonathan Delafield Butt. I'm a senior lecturer in early years at the University of Strathclyde, and I'm a developmental psychologist very interested in how young babies and young children come to make sense of the world. And especially I'm very interested in the affective or the feeling side of their development and the importance of this for growth and development, and ultimately for in terms of education, for learning. My work has taken me from very basic brain science. I started off here at Edinburgh with a PhD in brain development, very interested in the way that cells grew to become a very complex brain inside a very complex body, and then orchestrating and organizing very rich affective as well as perceptual experiences. So this got me going, and it introduced me into the behavior and the way that babies' behaviors are patterned and the way that their social behaviors are patterned in a storytelling-like form. So this is the work of Colwyn Trevarthen, of course, and Stephen Malloch, who recognized that mother-ease and mother-infant communication had a musical quality to it. And one of the aspects of that was that they had a musical narrative quality. So it was non-verbal. There weren't words attached to the different expressions, but the coos and the ga's and the eye gaze and the gestural expression through movements of the body, they all worked together parsing back and forth between mother and infant to make what was called in musicology or in musician talk a narrative. It formed a narrative structure. So this is very interesting because narrative is also recognized as being something that allows us to understand the world, even at a very high, sophisticated level in law, science, or in lay conversation. We tell stories to each other about the way things are. And children learn about the world through stories because that's the way we're able to understand the contextual relations of things. And this storytelling, this narrative understanding or narrative, what we call narrative meaning making, is evident in the very first engagements of the newborn with the mother or with the primary caregiver. So this suggests that this storytelling nature, this narrative understanding of the world is there from the beginning of life. So as a embryologist originally studying the development of a brain in utero, in the mother's womb before it's forming a fully fledged fetus, before it becomes a baby. The question is, well, when does this arise in development? Because it's there, it seems to be there from birth, from the very earliest interactions between a mother and a baby. So if we look back at the kinds of movements that the baby is making, the fetus, is making in utero, we see that these also share some common forms of storytelling. And that is that there's a process, and that process is coherent. It begins, it goes somewhere, because it develops over time, introduces new characters and new ideas, which in the very early stages are expressed in simple body movement. And then it concludes, because somehow the story's reached a climactic point often, or a final point, and then it resolves into quiescence or quiet again. It disappears, and that's the end of the story. And that's when we close the book, that's when we leave the movie theatre, that's when we would leave the music hall, when that narrative is concluded. And in fetal life, these are the very first reachings to touch the placental wall, for example, the very first touch or turn of the body to reposition the fetus in a new position. And this always initiates, it develops in its sophistication a movement to touch, and then perhaps a body shift to turn, and then it concludes with a new set of relationships with its environment that it knows, a new understanding of the world, built through the process of the narrative. So I can get very technical here and talk a little bit about how movement, to move, is also a narrative, because when we move, it's with an eye to the future. So we're moving to achieve something. And even in the fetal organization of movement, we know that it's controlled with this eye to the future. So it initiates already with a sense of where it's going. It progresses through the pattern of control of the musculatures to get there. It gets there, and then it concludes. Well, that's the very basic structure of a narrative. That's the very basic structure of a story. And it's there in the simple movements of a fetus from before it was born. Then that becomes obviously elaborated, more advanced when the fetus becomes a newborn baby, and it has that basic structure to engage, to make sense of social interaction with his or her mother or his or her caregiver. And that becomes then the invariant template, effectively, of understanding the world and making meaning in the world with another person, or between objects, with taking objects and putting them together and seeing what happens, what are the consequences. So this idea of storytelling or narrative being a foundation of understanding the world is very important for understanding the child as a meaning-making, as a learning being, and also as a social being, engaging with other people to make sense of the world. And this is what really starts to flourish, especially after 9 months, when you start to introduce objects and so on into the mother-infant relationship. At 9 months, there's the 9-month revolution. It's the beginning of secondary intersubjectivity, to go back to Colwyn's work, which is seminal from the late 70s, to show us that before the 9-month revolution, the mother-infant engagements are really face-to-face. It's all about feeling and intention and the expressions coming from within. But then at 9 months, they start to share an interest in objects. The leaf on the ground, the strawberry, the wooden cube, the dog's ears, and they share that interest and they work with it, and they begin to develop again these stories. They're non-verbal stories, but they're happenings. And that's when then the infant's cognitive ability starts to flourish. But before then, it's feeling-based. It's all about the feeling of things, like a piece of music or a dance, the feeling of where the dance is leading to. And importantly for me, there's always a sense of where that's going. There's always a sense that this is going someplace and it's concluding. And when it arrives there, there's a sense of satisfaction at that moment of completion. So I think that's a very good foundation for understanding storytelling and the importance of storytelling and the importance of storytelling in social connection. But the Connected Baby film really is one of Suzanne's first engagements with public filmmaking and so forth, to bring this science into the world, and it opens up the story about how we can understand that connectedness between a baby and an adult, a mother especially, and why that's important, and then bringing in these questions about stories and attachment and so on into the mix, and its importance in political policy and educational practice, for example. So it's going to be a great series.
Great tip landed on the bench behind you, and we've got a robin down here.
Oh, really?
Joining in
as well. Cool. Yeah. It's like Disney. It's like a Disney film, isn't it? Yeah. Where's Bambi?